The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, the faint whispers of wind weaving through the towering trees. Darkness cloaked the forest, broken only by fragmented moonlight filtering through the canopy above. The quiet was oppressive, interrupted only by the sharp crunch of leaves beneath hurried footsteps. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she stumbled into a clearing, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She turned, eyes wide, scanning the shadows, her hands trembling as they clutched a small flashlight that barely penetrated the dark. Behind her, the figure emerged, a man, his presence more monstrous than human in the dim light. His movements were deliberate, his approach slow, as if savoring the fear radiating from her. The flashlight trembled in her grasp, its beam flickering over his face for just a moment. What she saw made her blood run cold. The cruel smirk, the unrelenting gaze. He was a predator, and she was his prey. "Leave me alone," she cried, her voice cracking, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. The man said nothing, his shadow stretching across the forest floor like an omen. Sarah's back hit the rough bark of a tree as she retreated, her options dwindling. Her mind raced, but her body froze, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Time stretched, each heartbeat an eternity, each breath a shallow gasp. Then it happened. A sharp rustle in the underbrush drew both their attention. For a split second, Sarah dared to hope it was help, a person, perhaps, or even an animal fleeing the same danger. But what emerged was something she could not have anticipated. A wild deer stepped into the clearing, its antlers gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was majestic and otherworldly, its movements impossibly graceful. For a moment, both Sarah and her attacker were stunned into silence. The man recovered first. He scoffed, a low, guttural sound. "A deer," he muttered, almost amused, taking a step forward. But the deer did not retreat. Its dark eyes, deep and unyielding, locked onto him. Something about the animal's posture tense, coiled, ready was unnerving. The man hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. That pause was all it took. With a sudden burst of speed, the deer charged. Its hooves thundered against the earth, its antlers aimed with precision. The man barely had time to react before the animal collided with him, its raw power sending him sprawling onto the ground. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he scrambled backward, the predator now reduced to prey. Sarah's mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. Her fear, once suffocating, gave way to an overwhelming sense of awe. The deer stood over the man, its chest heaving, its breath visible in the cold night air. It didn't attack further, but its presence was enough to keep him pinned in place. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The man cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling as he crawled away, disappearing into the shadows from which he had emerged. The deer did not pursue him. Instead, it turned its attention to Sarah. She froze, her body still trembling, but the terror she expected didn't come. The animal's gaze was steady, almost reassuring, as if to say, "You're safe now." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The deer bounded into the darkness, its form swallowed by the trees. Sarah was left alone in the clearing, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and gratitude. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. Relief washed over her in waves, but with it came a gnawing question. Why would a deer risk its life for a stranger? The forest seemed to hum around her, alive in a way she had never noticed before. The wind carried whispers through the leaves, and the shadows seemed to shift with purpose. Sarah had always thought of the wilderness as indifferent, a vast expanse of nature that neither cared for nor noticed her. But now she wasn't so sure. The clearing felt sacred, imbued with a power she couldn't explain. The trees stood as silent witnesses, their branches reaching like arms to shield the sky. The ground beneath her was firm, grounding her as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a coincidence? A fluke? Or was there something more, something extraordinary about the deer and its actions? The question lingered in her mind, refusing to let go, as she slowly rose to her feet. The forest, once haunting and oppressive, now seemed alive with possibilities. She looked into the darkness where the deer had vanished, a spark of determination flickering within her. Whatever the truth was, she would find it. Sarah Jennings had always been a creature of the city. Born and raised in the bustling heart of Chicago, her life had been a cacophony of blaring horns, hurried footsteps, and endless nights illuminated by the soft glow of neon lights. She thrived in the chaos, climbing the corporate ladder with relentless determination. Yet, for all her success, Sarah was no stranger to solitude. Beneath her poised exterior lay a woman who had carefully walled off her heart, keeping others at arm's length. It was a self-preservation tactic she'd honed since childhood, a way to weather life's storms without appearing vulnerable. But even the strongest walls can crack. Sarah's life unraveled one fateful evening when a drunk driver ran a red light, shattering her world in an instant. The accident claimed her fiancé, David, a man who had, against all odds, managed to breach her defenses and make her believe in love. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and guilt. Sarah replayed their last conversation endlessly, tormenting herself with the memory of their argument about something so trivial it now felt absurd. She had stormed out, slamming the door behind her. He had followed her, calling out apologies she refused to hear. Hours later, he was gone. The city became unbearable. Every corner reminded her of David, the coffee shop where they'd spent lazy Sunday mornings, the park bench where he'd proposed, even the crosswalk where they'd laughed about jaywalking together. Each memory felt like a blade twisting deeper into her chest. Unable to cope, Sarah made a radical decision: she would leave it all behind. It was Jack, an old friend from her childhood summers spent in Wisconsin, who suggested the cabin. Nestled deep within the heart of Blackwater Forest, it was the perfect place to disappear. Jack had inherited the property from his late grandfather and used it as a hunting lodge, though he swore the forest was far more suited to quiet reflection than sport. When Sarah reached out, he didn't hesitate to offer it to her. At first, the thought of moving to such a remote place felt absurd. Sarah had never been one for the wilderness. Her idea of roughing it was a boutique hotel without room service. But desperation has a way of reshaping priorities. In the days leading up to her departure, she sold nearly everything she owned, packing only the essentials into her car. It was a bittersweet process, liberating, yet heavy with finality. By the time she reached the cabin, she felt stripped down to the core, a hollow version of herself. The cabin was smaller than she'd imagined, a weathered structure with peeling paint and creaky floorboards that whispered stories of its past. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, hemmed in by ancient pines that towered like sentinels. The forest was dense, its depths obscured by layers of shadow and mist. It seemed to breathe, alive with the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Sarah felt dwarfed by its enormity, a speck in a world she barely understood. At first, the solitude was unbearable. Nights were the worst. Sarah would lie awake, staring at the ceiling as the forest came alive with strange sounds. The hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small creatures, the mournful cry of a distant coyote, all of it felt foreign and menacing. Her grief clung to her like a second skin, seeping into every corner of the cabin. Even the simplest tasks, like chopping firewood or boiling water for tea, felt insurmountable. But slowly, the forest began to work its quiet magic. Sarah found herself drawn to its rhythms, its unspoken rules. She started taking long walks, her boots crunching over fallen leaves, as she explored the labyrinthine trails. There was something meditative about the way the light filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of gold and green. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine. For the first time in months, Sarah felt her mind quieting, the relentless cycle of grief giving way to moments of stillness. One afternoon, she stumbled upon a small stream, its crystal-clear water tumbling over smooth stones. She knelt by the bank, cupping her hands to drink. The water was icy, shocking her senses awake. As she sat there, watching the sunlight dance on the ripples, she felt an unexpected pang of peace. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that perhaps, somewhere within her, there was still a capacity for healing. The forest wasn't just a refuge, it became a teacher. Sarah learned to identify the tracks of deer and rabbits, to recognize the calls of different birds, and to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled an approaching storm. She marveled at the resilience of the wildlife, creatures that survived against all odds in a world both beautiful and unforgiving. Their adaptability became a source of quiet inspiration. Still, the grief lingered. Some days it felt as raw as it had in those first few weeks after the accident. But now, in the vast stillness of the forest, Sarah found herself confronting it head-on. She wrote letters to David, pouring out her guilt, her anger, her longing. She burned them in the fire, watching as the ash floated skyward. It was a small ritual, but it helped. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in hues of amber and violet, Sarah stood on the porch of the cabin, a mug of tea warming her hands. The world felt vast and quiet, as though holding its breath. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future, not one where she would forget David, but one where she could carry his memory without being consumed by it. In the months that followed, Sarah began to feel a tenuous sense of belonging in the forest. She wasn't just a visitor anymore, she was a part of its ecosystem. The cabin became her sanctuary, a place where she could begin to rebuild herself. But the forest, for all its beauty, was not without its dangers. There were moments when she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She chalked it up to her imagination, the lingering remnants of her city-born skepticism. It wasn't until she crossed paths with the deer for the first time that she began to question the forest's true nature. It was early morning, the air thick with mist that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. She had been gathering firewood when she saw a magnificent buck standing at the edge of the clearing, its antlers silhouetted against the rising sun. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sarah felt a strange, inexplicable connection. It wasn't just an animal, it was something more, something ancient and knowing. The encounter left her shaken, though she couldn't say why. She dismissed it as a fluke, a one-time experience. But the deer returned, always at the edge of her vision, always watching. It became a silent companion, a guardian she didn't quite understand. And though she didn't know it yet, their bond would become the key to her survival and her transformation. In the stillness of the forest, Sarah began to rebuild not just her life, but herself. Piece by piece, she was learning to move forward. But as she would soon discover, the forest had its own plans for her, and the deer was only the beginning. The forest was a living, breathing entity. It sprawled endlessly, a mosaic of towering pines, oaks, and birches that swayed in the whispers of an unbroken wind. Their branches reached skyward like silent supplicants, intertwining to form a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into delicate patches of gold and green. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth, a fragrance so pure and ancient it seemed to seep into Sarah's very bones. The trails that wove through the forest were hardly more than whispers themselves, narrow paths lined with moss and ferns, their edges softened by years of leaf litter and time. Beneath her boots, the ground was soft and spongy, giving way slightly with each step. Sometimes, she'd stumble upon gnarled tree roots protruding from the earth like skeletal fingers, a reminder of the forest's age and resilience. But the forest was more than its surface beauty. It was a symphony of sounds, alive with the unending chatter of its inhabitants. The distant trill of a songbird echoed from somewhere high above, while the gentle rustle of leaves betrayed the scurrying of unseen creatures. Occasionally, the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot would startle her, a stark reminder that she was never truly alone. As the day stretched on, the forest would change, its moods shifting with the position of the sun. In the mornings it was bathed in a pale, golden light that dripped like honey through the trees. The mist would cling low to the ground, swirling in ghostly eddies as the warmth of the day slowly burned it away. By noon the forest was vibrant, alive with the buzzing of insects and the rustle of the breeze. Shadows played tricks on the eyes, and Sarah often found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see some phantom movement in the periphery of her vision. As twilight descended, the forest became a different place entirely. The fading light painted the trees in deep, haunting hues of indigo and amber. The birds grew quiet, replaced by the distant, mournful call of an owl. The trails, so inviting in the daylight, now felt foreboding, their edges dissolving into darkness. The stillness was palpable, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of underbrush. These sounds, so mundane during the day, took on an eerie quality at night, stirring the imagination. Despite its beauty, the forest carried an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't just its sheer enormity or the way it seemed to envelop her completely, though both were intimidating. It was something subtler, something that gnawed at the edges of her perception. There were moments when Sarah felt the forest watching her, its ancient eyes following her every move. The feeling was strongest in the deepest parts of the woods, where the sunlight struggled to penetrate and the silence felt heavy, oppressive. It was as though the forest itself were a sentient being, assessing her, deciding whether she belonged. Occasionally, she would come across signs that all was not as it should be. A rusted animal trap half buried in the dirt, its sharp jaws still set to snap. A pile of ashes and charred wood, evidence of an old, illegal campfire. Once, she found a patch of bark stripped from a tree, the marks jagged and fresh. These reminders of human intrusion were jarring, a violent contrast to the harmony of the forest. The most unsettling sign of all came during one of her early hikes. Sarah had wandered farther than usual, lured by the promise of a nearby stream Jack had mentioned. She had just stepped over a fallen log when she saw a deep, bloody groove carved into the earth. The trail of blood led to a patch of flattened grass, and though the scene was days old, the faint metallic tang still lingered in the air. She couldn't tell what had happened there, but the sight left her unnerved. Something had been hunted, dragged, and left to die. The forest was a place of contradictions. It could cradle her in its serenity, offering moments of breathtaking stillness where the world seemed to hold its breath. In those moments, Sarah felt at peace, as though the forest were whispering its secrets to her, urging her to heal. But in the next instant, it could turn, its shadows deepening, its sounds growing sharp and accusatory. The same trails that felt welcoming one moment could twist and darken, leaving her disoriented and uneasy. Even the wildlife seemed to reflect this duality. She had watched in awe as a family of deer emerged from the underbrush, their movements graceful and deliberate. Their soft, liquid eyes held an intelligence that felt almost human. Yet, just as easily, she could stumble upon the skeleton of a small animal picked clean by predators, a stark reminder of the forest's unforgiving nature. One afternoon, as she stood on the edge of a small clearing, Sarah spotted a hawk circling high above. Its sharp cry pierced the air as it dove toward the ground, talons extended. The sight was mesmerizing, a reminder of the raw, unfiltered reality of life in the wild. There was no pretense here, no veil of civility to soften the edges of existence. The forest was honest in its brutality, and Sarah found herself both repelled and drawn to it. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice patterns in the forest's behavior. The animals moved differently when a storm was approaching, their calls growing frantic and urgent. The wind would shift, carrying with it the scent of rain and the electric tang of ozone. Even the trees seemed to brace themselves, their leaves rustling in anticipation. But there were other changes, subtler ones that she couldn't explain. Sometimes, she would step onto a trail she had walked a dozen times, only to find it felt unfamiliar. The forest seemed to shift around her, its paths reconfiguring like a labyrinth. Once, she found herself completely turned around, convinced she was heading back to the cabin only to realize she had wandered deeper into the woods. It was as if the forest were alive, testing her, pushing her to prove she could navigate its depths. Despite her growing familiarity, there were areas of the forest Sarah avoided instinctively. One such place was a grove of ancient, twisted trees, their trunks gnarled and scarred as though by some long-forgotten battle. The air there felt different, heavier somehow, and the sounds of the forest seemed muted. She couldn't explain why, but the grove left her unsettled, and she always quickened her pace when she passed through it. The forest was a paradox, a place of breathtaking beauty and quiet menace. It held secrets in its depths, secrets that Sarah could feel pressing against her, waiting to be uncovered. And though she didn't fully understand it yet, the forest was changing her. It was stripping away the layers of who she had been, reshaping her into someone who could face what was to come. Jack Nolan was the first person Sarah had spoken to after arriving at the cabin. A grizzled man in his late 40s, with a sun-weathered face and a perpetual layer of stubble, Jack carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in the wilderness. He wasn't one for small talk, preferring to let his actions speak for him. The first time they met, he'd appeared on her porch unannounced, carrying a bundle of firewood like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're the city girl Jack mentioned," he said by way of introduction, setting the wood down with a thud. "Welcome to Blackwater Forest." Sarah had bristled at the label city girl, but Jack's demeanor made it hard to take offense. There was a kindness in his eyes, tempered by years of experience. He didn't linger long that first visit, but over the following weeks, he became a regular presence. Sometimes he'd stop by with practical advice, a warning about an incoming storm or tips on avoiding bears. Other times he'd simply sit on her porch, nursing a thermos of coffee as they watched the forest together in companionable silence. Jack spoke about the forest like it was an old friend, one he respected deeply but didn't fully trust. "It's beautiful, sure," he said one evening, his voice low and measured, "but it's not tame, never will be. You've got to respect that, or it'll eat you alive." It was Jack who first mentioned the poachers. He brought it up casually, almost as an afterthought, but Sarah caught the tension in his voice. "You hear gunshots? Or see anything out of place, you come find me. Don't try to handle it yourself." "Poachers?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. Jack nodded. "They've been getting bolder, not just deer and rabbits anymore. They're after the big game, bears, wolves, anything they can sell. I've been trying to track them down, but it's like chasing shadows." His warning unsettled Sarah. She had come to the forest seeking peace, but now it seemed even this remote sanctuary was not immune to human greed. Jack's presence, however, was a source of reassurance. He was a steady, grounded figure, someone who understood the forest in a way Sarah could only aspire to, though she wouldn't realize it until much later. Sarah's attacker had been watching her from the moment she arrived at the cabin. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting sense of unease, the prickling sensation of being watched that she dismissed as paranoia. But the signs were there: a boot print in the soft earth near her cabin, the faint smell of tobacco smoke lingering in the air. He was a shadow in the periphery of her life, a phantom whose motives remained unclear. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of movement in the forest, a flash of dark clothing, the glint of metal in the sunlight. On one occasion she returned from a hike to find her cabin door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing, but the intrusion left her shaken. Jack noticed her unease and pressed her about it. "You're jumpier than usual. Something happened." Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to voice her fears. "Probably nothing," she said finally. "Just, I keep feeling like I'm being watched." Jack's expression darkened. "You see anything, or anyone, you let me know. Promise me that." Though she nodded, Sarah couldn't bring herself to admit the full extent of her apprehension. The idea of someone lurking in the forest, watching her every move, felt too surreal to put into words, and yet, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The attacker's presence loomed like a storm on the horizon, an unnamed threat that would soon shatter her fragile sense of safety. The deer appeared for the first time on a cool autumn morning. Sarah had been chopping wood behind the cabin, her breath fogging in the crisp air, when she felt it a prickling at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, half expecting to see Jack or one of the local hunters. Instead, she found herself staring into the deep, liquid eyes of a stag. It was unlike any deer Sarah had ever seen. Its coat was a rich, russet brown that seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight, and its antlers were massive, branching out like the roots of an ancient tree. The stag stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was almost unsettling. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the stag turned and melted back into the forest. The encounter left Sarah shaken, though she couldn't explain why. It wasn't just the stag's size or its uncanny stillness, it was the way it had looked at her, as though it were trying to convey something. She dismissed the thought as fanciful, the product of her overactive imagination, but the stag continued to appear. Sometimes it would stand at the edge of the clearing, half hidden among the trees. Other times, Sarah would catch glimpses of it on her hikes, its antlers cutting a majestic silhouette against the horizon. It never came close, but its presence was constant, a silent shadow that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Jack noticed her preoccupation one afternoon as they sat on the porch. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked, his tone knowing. "Seen who?" "The stag. People around here call him the Watcher. He's been around for years, always keeping an eye on things. Some folks think he's just a regular deer." But Jack trailed off, his expression thoughtful. "There's something different about him. Always has been." "Different how?" Jack shrugged. "Can't put my finger on it, but he's smarter than any animal has a right to be. If he's watching you, it's for a reason." Sarah didn't know what to make of Jack's words, but she couldn't deny the truth of them. The stag's presence was more than chance, it was deliberate, purposeful, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, she felt a strange sense of comfort in its silent vigil. It was as though the stag were a guardian, one she didn't yet realize she would need. As the days passed, the forest's characters, Jack, the shadowy attacker, and the enigmatic deer wove themselves into Sarah's life, each adding a layer of complexity to her journey. And though she didn't know it yet, their fates were inextricably linked, drawing her toward a confrontation that would change everything. The forest had always carried an air of mystery, but in the weeks following her encounter with the stag, Sarah began to sense something more ominous creeping into its depths. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes: the faint smell of smoke drifting through the air on mornings when the forest should have smelled of damp earth and pine, or the muffled thud of footsteps far off in the distance when no one should have been nearby. At first she told herself it was nothing. The forest was vast and alive, filled with countless creatures moving unseen through its shadows. But as the days passed, the signs became harder to ignore. One afternoon, while exploring a new trail, Sarah stumbled upon a crude trap hidden among the underbrush. It was a rusted snare, its jagged teeth set to spring shut on anything unfortunate enough to wander into its path. Kneeling beside it, Sarah felt a surge of anger and disgust. The trap was cruel, designed to maim rather than kill, leaving its victims to die slowly and painfully. She couldn't imagine what kind of person would leave such a device in the heart of the forest. Her first instinct was to disable it, but the thought of handling the trap made her stomach churn. Instead, she marked the location on her map and resolved to tell Jack about it the next time she saw him. But the discovery lingered in her mind long after she'd moved on, casting a shadow over the forest's beauty. It was a reminder that not everyone who entered the woods did so with respect or reverence. The gunshots came next. At first, they were distant, muffled by the thickness of the trees, but their sudden, sharp echoes startled her all the same. She heard them most often in the early mornings, before the sun had fully risen, or in the dusky twilight hours when the forest seemed to hold its breath. Each shot sent a shiver down her spine, a violent intrusion into the serene world she had come to love. One morning, as she stood on the porch sipping her coffee, a particularly loud shot rang out, startling a flock of birds into flight. The sound reverberated through the trees, setting her teeth on edge. Sarah set her mug down and stepped off the porch, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the quiet rustle of leaves as the birds settled back into the branches. When she mentioned the gunshots to Jack, his expression darkened. "Poachers," he said grimly, the word heavy with contempt. "I've been tracking them for weeks, but they're good at covering their tracks. Don't go out alone until we figure out where they're hiding. If they think you're onto them, they won't hesitate to scare you off." The warning unsettled her. Sarah had always felt uneasy about the idea of being watched, but now that unease took on a sharper edge. The poachers weren't just a distant threat, they were here, moving through the same trails and clearings she had come to think of as her sanctuary. The thought made her skin crawl. As the days wore on, Sarah's unease grew. She began to notice small, inexplicable signs that she wasn't alone in the forest. A cigarette butt crushed into the dirt near her cabin, a scrap of torn fabric snagged on a branch. Once, she found footprints, large, heavy impressions in the soft earth that didn't match her own boots or Jack's well-worn hiking shoes. The prints led away from her cabin, vanishing into the underbrush, as though their maker had been careful to obscure their path. At night, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. Sarah would sit by the fire, her book forgotten in her lap, as her eyes darted toward the windows. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness, impenetrable and silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. But every so often she thought she saw movement, a shadow flitting past the edge of the clearing, too quick and indistinct to be anything more than her imagination. The only thing that brought her any sense of comfort was the deer. The stag's appearances had become more frequent, almost as though it were keeping watch over her. Sometimes she would find it standing at the edge of the clearing in the early mornings, its massive antlers catching the first rays of sunlight. Other times, she would catch a glimpse of it on her hikes, its dark eyes tracking her as she passed. Despite its silent presence, the stag's behavior left her with more questions than answers. Why did it always appear when she was alone? How did it always seem to know where to find her? Jack's words echoed in her mind, "If he's watching you, it's for a reason." But what reason could there possibly be? One evening, as Sarah was walking back to the cabin after a long day of exploring, she felt it again, the prickling sensation of being watched. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding as she turned in a slow circle. The forest was quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, hidden just beyond the trees. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound confident. The word echoed back to her, hollow and empty. There was no response, but the sensation of eyes on her didn't fade. She quickened her pace, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. By the time she reached the cabin, her nerves were frayed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to steady herself. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the familiar scent of wood smoke filling the room. But the sense of safety she had once felt within the cabin's walls was gone. That night, as she lay in bed, the sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, set her on edge. And in the quiet moments between those sounds, she thought she heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, as though someone were testing the strength of the cabin's walls. By morning the tapping was gone, leaving Sarah to wonder if she had imagined it, but the fear remained, burrowing into her chest like a thorn. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around her, its shadows growing darker and more menacing with each passing day. And though the stag continued to watch over her, its presence was no longer enough to dispel her unease. The forest, once a place of solace and healing, had become a realm of uncertainty and fear. And Sarah, though she didn't know it yet, was on the precipice of a confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace she had worked so hard to build. The morning air was crisp and biting as Sarah set out on the trail, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the forest's stillness. The unease that had settled over her in recent weeks hadn't faded, but she refused to let it confine her to the cabin. The forest, for all its recent shadows, still held a strange allure, a quiet promise of clarity she desperately needed. She was following a narrow, overgrown path she hadn't explored before, the ground soft beneath her boots, when she heard voices. They were faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Her heart quickened as she crouched instinctively, pressing herself against the trunk of a massive oak tree. Peering cautiously around its rough bark, she spotted them, 2 men standing in a small clearing about 50 yards ahead. Both were dressed in dark, weathered clothing that blended into the forest. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, carried a rifle slung across his back. The other was thinner, with a wiry frame and a restless energy that made him shift his weight from foot to foot to foot. They spoke in low voices, their words muffled by the distance, but the tension in their body language was clear. Sarah's stomach churned as she watched. These were the poachers Jack had warned her about. Her first instinct was to back away slowly, to retreat the way she had come and warn Jack. But as she shifted her weight, a branch snapped beneath her boot, the sharp crack shattering the forest's quiet. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself tighter against the tree, her pulse pounding in her ears. What was that one of them muttered, his voice sharper now, tinged with suspicion. The taller man unslung his rifle, his eyes scanning the trees. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping toward the source of the sound. Could be a deer. Sarah's mind raced as she weighed her options. Running would only draw attention, and she doubted she could move silently enough to avoid being heard. She glanced around desperately, searching for a hiding spot, when a sudden rustling in the underbrush to her left drew the men's attention. The stag emerged from the shadows, its antlers catching the sunlight in a display that was both majestic and disorienting. It stood motionless for a moment, its dark eyes locked on the men, before taking a deliberate step forward. The wiry man swore under his breath, raising a hand to shield his eyes from the glare. "That thing's massive," he muttered. The taller man hesitated, his grip tightening on the rifle. "We'll deal with it later," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got bigger priorities." The stag turned its head slightly, its gaze shifting to meet Sarah's. For a fleeting moment, she felt as though it understood her predicament, as though it had appeared not by chance but by design. Then, without warning, it bolted into the trees, its hooves thundering against the forest floor. The men followed, their attention diverted, and Sarah seized the opportunity to slip away, her heart pounding as she hurried back toward the cabin. The encounter left Sarah rattled, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. Over the next few days, she debated whether to return to the clearing. Jack's warnings echoed in her mind, but the thought of leaving the poachers unchecked was unbearable. If they were hunting in the forest, they weren't just a threat to her, they were a threat to everything she had come to care about. On a chilly, overcast morning, she set out again, this time armed with a small camera Jack had lent her for documenting wildlife. Her plan was simple: find evidence of the poachers' activity and bring it to Jack. The thought of confronting them directly was unthinkable, but if she could gather proof, perhaps he could take action. It took hours of cautious searching, but she finally found a crude campsite hidden deep within the forest. The clearing was littered with trash, empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and discarded food wrappers. A small fire pit sat at its center, its ashes still faintly warm, suggesting the men hadn't gone far. Nearby, she spotted something that made her stomach turn: a pile of animal pelts, their fur matted with dried blood. A metal cooler sat beside them, its lid slightly ajar to reveal packages of meat wrapped in plastic. The scene was a grotesque testament to the poachers' work, a stark reminder of the forest's vulnerability. As she knelt to photograph the evidence, Sarah's eyes caught movement on the edge of the clearing. She froze, her breath hitching as she realized one of the poachers was returning. It was the wiry man, his rifle slung lazily over one shoulder, as he approached the camp. Sarah's mind raced as she scanned her surroundings for cover, finally settling on a dense thicket of shrubs a few yards away. Crouching low, she held her breath as the man entered the clearing. He dropped a bag near the fire pit, muttering to himself as he rummaged through the cooler. Every second felt like an eternity as Sarah remained hidden, her muscles tense and her heartbeat deafening in her ears. She was so focused on the poacher that she almost didn't notice the stag standing at the edge of the clearing. It appeared silently, as though materializing from the shadows, its presence commanding and otherworldly. The man didn't seem to notice it at first, too preoccupied with his task, but when he finally looked up, his reaction was immediate. "Damn thing again," he muttered, reaching for his rifle, but before he could raise it, the stag moved not away, but toward him. Its steps were slow and deliberate, its antlers gleaming like a warning. The man faltered, his hand hovering uncertainly over the rifle. "What the hell?" he murmured, his voice trailing off. The stag's gaze never wavered, its presence somehow larger than life, as though the very forest had sent it to intervene. The poacher backed away slowly, his bravado crumbling as the stag advanced. Finally, he turned and fled, his footsteps fading into the distance. Sarah remained hidden until she was certain he was gone. Then, trembling with adrenaline, she emerged from the thicket and hurried back to the cabin, her mind racing. The stag's actions had been too calculated, too precise to be mere coincidence. It had saved her twice now, and she was beginning to suspect it wasn't just an ordinary deer. Back at the cabin, she spread out the photos she had taken, each one a grim testament to the poacher's presence. As she stared at the evidence, a newfound resolve took root in her chest. The forest was under threat, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever the stag's role in all of this, one thing was clear: she wasn't alone in this fight. The stag's presence had become an undeniable part of Sarah's daily life. At first, she had dismissed its appearances as mere coincidence, a wild animal curious about the human who had invaded its territory. But as time went on, its behavior defied explanation. The stag wasn't just passing through, it was watching her, tracking her movements with a deliberate precision that sent shivers down her spine. One afternoon, as Sarah was gathering firewood near the edge of the clearing, she felt it again, that prickling sensation of being observed. Turning slowly, she found the stag standing just beyond the tree line, its antlers silhouetted against the dappled sunlight. It didn't move, didn't flee as most animals would when noticed. Instead, it held her gaze with a stillness that felt unnervingly human. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. The stag didn't respond, of course, but something in its dark, fathomless eyes made her feel as though it understood her words. Then, with a slow, almost regal movement, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. The stag's appearances weren't confined to moments of danger. Sometimes it would appear during her hikes, walking parallel to her at a distance, its steps so silent she wouldn't have noticed it if not for the occasional glimpse of its antlers through the trees. Other times, she would find subtle signs of its presence, hoofprints in the soft earth near her cabin, or tufts of russet fur caught on a low branch. It was as though the stag were marking its presence, reminding her that it was always near. The occurrences weren't always benign. One night, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the stars, she heard the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. She tensed, her mind immediately jumping to the poachers, but when she stood and peered into the darkness, she saw only the stag, its massive form barely visible in the moonlight. It wasn't until the next morning that she discovered the overturned traps scattered near the clearing. The jagged teeth had been sprung, their mechanisms crushed beyond repair. Sarah stared at the traps in disbelief, her mind racing. Had the stag done this? The idea seemed ludicrous. Animals didn't think or act that way, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the forest. The stag's actions felt purposeful, almost as though it were trying to communicate something. But what? And why her? The questions swirled in her mind, their answers eluding her like smoke slipping through her fingers. It was Jack who first hinted at the deeper connection between Sarah, the stag, and the forest. They were sitting on the porch one evening, sharing a thermos of coffee, as the last light of day faded into twilight. Sarah, unable to keep her thoughts to herself any longer, told him about the traps she had found and the stag's strange behavior. Jack listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're not the first person that stag's taken an interest in," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "And you won't be the last." "What do you mean?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward. Jack hesitated, as though weighing how much to tell her. "Folks around here have stories about him. They call him the Watcher. Say he's been around for decades, maybe longer. Always shows up when the forest's in trouble. Poachers, wildfires, anything that threatens the balance. But he's not just any deer. There's something different about him." "Different how?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack shrugged, his expression distant. "Hard to explain. Some people think he's just an unusually smart animal. Others say he's something else, something older. A guardian, maybe. All I know is, when he shows up, it means you're part of something bigger." The cryptic remark lingered in Sarah's mind long after Jack had left. Part of something bigger. What did that even mean? She thought back to the stag's piercing gaze, the way it seemed to see straight through her, as though it knew her better than she knew herself. The idea unsettled her, but it also ignited a flicker of curiosity she couldn't ignore. That night, Sarah dreamed of the forest. It was darker than she had ever seen it, the trees stretching impossibly high, their branches forming an impenetrable canopy. The stag stood at the center of it all, its antlers glowing faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Sarah felt its presence like a pulse, steady and unyielding. When she woke, her heart was pounding, her skin damp with sweat. The dream felt more like a memory than a figment of her imagination. Over the following days, Jack's words began to take on new meaning. As Sarah explored the forest, she started noticing things she hadn't before, subtle patterns in the way the trees grew, the way the animals moved. It was as though the forest had a rhythm, a quiet harmony that underpinned everything, and the stag was at the center of it, a living embodiment of its will. But Sarah wasn't the only one who seemed to recognize the stag's importance. On one of her hikes, she came across a clearing littered with strange symbols carved into the bark of the surrounding trees. The symbols were crude but deliberate, their meanings inscrutable. At the center of the clearing lay a small pile of stones arranged in a pattern that felt oddly ceremonial. It was a place that hummed with an energy Sarah couldn't name, and she left it feeling both awed and unnerved. The stag's behavior, Jack's cryptic remarks, and the strange occurrences in the forest all pointed to one thing: there was more to this place than met the eye. Sarah's initial quest for solitude had become something far more complex, a journey that seemed to be leading her toward answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. And yet, for all the questions swirling in her mind, one truth was becoming increasingly clear: the stag wasn't just watching over her, it was guiding her, drawing her toward something she couldn't yet see, something that would change everything. Sarah's life in the forest had become a delicate balance between quiet solitude and the looming threat of the poachers. The tension finally broke one late afternoon when she heard a sound that froze her in place, the anguished cry of an animal. It was a raw, haunting noise that seemed to echo through the trees, cutting through the tranquil hum of the forest. Without hesitation, she set off in the direction of the sound, her heart pounding as the cries grew louder. When she arrived, the scene before her was worse than she had imagined. A young doe lay tangled in a snare, its legs bleeding where the jagged metal teeth had bitten into its flesh. Its wide eyes were filled with terror as it thrashed against the trap. Sarah's stomach twisted at the sight, but she forced herself to move forward, murmuring softly to calm the frightened animal. As she worked to free the doe, the snap of a twig behind her made her whip around, her breath catching in her throat. Two poachers stepped into the clearing, their expressions a mix of surprise and annoyance. One of them, the wiry man she had seen at the camp, sneered as he took a step closer. "Well, well," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Look who we have here, playing forest ranger, are we?" Sarah's heart raced as she stood between the doe and the men, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "This animal doesn't belong to you. Let it go." The taller man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You're trespassing, lady. You've got no idea what you're messing with." "I know exactly what I'm messing with," she shot back, surprising even herself with her defiance. "You don't belong here." The wiry man's sneer turned into a scowl. He gestured toward the rifle slung over his companion's shoulder. "You sure about that?" Before Sarah could respond, a deep rustling sound came from the tree line. The stag emerged, its massive form commanding instant attention. The poachers froze, their bravado faltering as the stag locked eyes with them, its presence as imposing as a thunderstorm. It took a single step forward, its antlers gleaming like a crown, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. "This ain't worth it," the taller man muttered, grabbing his companion's arm. "Let's go." The wiry man hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sarah, the doe, and the stag. Finally, with a muttered curse, he turned and followed his partner into the trees. Sarah exhaled shakily, her knees nearly giving way beneath her. The stag watched her silently as she freed the doe, which limped away into the forest with a final, grateful glance. When Sarah turned back to thank the stag, it was gone. The poachers didn't let the confrontation go unanswered. Over the next several days, Sarah found herself increasingly on edge as she navigated the forest. The sense of being watched had grown into something far more tangible, snapshots of movement in her periphery, muffled voices carried on the wind, the occasional gleam of a rifle barrel catching the sunlight. One evening, as Sarah returned to the cabin after a hike, she found her porch in disarray. The firewood she had stacked neatly was scattered across the ground, and the door, though still locked, bore deep scratches along its surface. Inside, nothing appeared to be disturbed, but the message was clear: she wasn't safe. The tension escalated when Sarah encountered the poachers again. She had ventured deeper into the forest than usual, determined to gather more evidence for Jack. Instead, she stumbled upon the poachers in the middle of gutting a freshly killed buck. Her gasp of horror betrayed her presence, and before she could flee, the wiry man spotted her. "Get her," he shouted, his voice slicing through the quiet. Sarah bolted, her heart hammering in her chest as she sprinted through the trees. The forest, once her sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and obstacles. She could hear the men crashing through the underbrush behind her, their shouts growing louder as they closed the distance. A low branch caught her across the face, leaving a stinging welt, but she didn't stop. Just when she thought her lungs would give out, the stag appeared, standing at the edge of a ravine that cut through the forest. It turned its head toward her, as though urging her forward. Without thinking, Sarah followed, leaping across the narrow gap and landing hard on the other side. The stag bolted, its movements fluid and unerring, and Sarah forced herself to keep up. The chase ended when the stag led her to a hidden hollow surrounded by dense thickets. She collapsed against a tree, gasping for air as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. The stag stood guard at the edge of the hollow, its ears swiveling attentively. When it finally turned and disappeared into the forest, Sarah felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude and an even stronger determination to stand her ground. The events of the past days left Sarah shaken to her core. Sitting by the fire that evening, she stared into the flames, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear was the most immediate and visceral fear of the poachers, of the danger she had unwittingly invited into her life. But beneath the fear lay guilt, a gnawing sense of responsibility for the escalating conflict. She had come to the forest seeking peace, yet her actions had drawn the attention of men who wouldn't hesitate to harm her. "Maybe Jack was right," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Maybe I should have stayed out of it." but even as the words left her lips, she knew she couldn't walk away. The image of the injured doe flashed through her mind, followed by the memory of the traps and the bloodied pelts. The forest wasn't just a place to her anymore, it was a living, breathing entity that had offered her refuge when she needed it most. Abandoning it now felt like a betrayal. The stag's presence added another layer to her turmoil. Its behavior defied explanation, challenging everything she thought she knew about the natural world. Was it simply a remarkably intelligent animal, or was there something more to it, something tied to the cryptic stories Jack had shared? And why had it chosen her? As the fire burned low, Sarah resolved to face her fears head-on. The poachers might be ruthless, but they didn't understand the forest the way she did. She wasn't the same person who had arrived here months ago, broken and lost. The forest had changed her, forging her into someone stronger, someone who could fight for what mattered. But even as she made her decision, a flicker of doubt remained. The stakes were higher than ever, and the next confrontation could cost her everything. Yet, deep down, Sarah knew she couldn't turn back. The forest had given her a purpose, and she intended to see it through no matter the cost. The relationship between Sarah and the stag had grown in ways she couldn't fully explain. It was more than just gratitude for the times it had protected her. It was a connection that felt ancient and profound, as though the stag were a part of the forest itself, and by extension, a part of her. The moment that solidified their bond came on a cold, gray morning when Sarah ventured deep into the forest in search of food. Her supplies were running low, and the recent encounters with the poachers had made it dangerous to venture into town. She decided to forage, using the knowledge she'd gleaned from Jack and her own research to find edible plants. The forest, however, seemed reluctant to give up its bounty. Hours passed as she combed the underbrush, her fingers growing numb from the chill. Frustration gnawed at her, as she found little more than a handful of bitter greens and a few mushrooms she wasn't entirely sure were safe. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Sarah began to worry she'd need to turn back empty-handed. That's when she saw the stag. It appeared at the edge of the clearing, silent as ever, its antlers casting long shadows in the fading light. Sarah watched in astonishment as it took a few deliberate steps toward her, then paused, turning its head as if to beckon her to follow. Without hesitation, she did. The stag led her through a maze of trees, its pace steady but unhurried. They walked for what felt like miles until it brought her to a grove she hadn't seen before. The ground was blanketed in wild berries, their dark, plump forms gleaming with dew. Nearby, a small stream gurgled, its clear water reflecting the first stars of the evening. Sarah dropped to her knees, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure the stag could understand her words. The stag stood at the edge of the grove, watching her with its calm, knowing eyes. For a moment, she felt as though they were the only two beings in the world, bound by an unspoken trust. The stag stayed until she had gathered enough berries to fill her bag, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Sarah watched it go, a lump forming in her throat. She realized she wasn't just surviving in the forest anymore, she was living, and it was because of this mysterious, majestic creature. The bond between them was unlike anything she'd ever known, and it filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For all her growing connection to the forest, Sarah knew she couldn't face the poachers alone. Her encounters with them had shown her the depths of their ruthlessness, and she needed allies if she had any hope of stopping them. Reluctantly, she began to open up to Jack about her fears and experiences. Jack, for his part, listened without judgment. When she told him about the traps, the poachers' campsite, and the stag's uncanny interventions, his expression grew more serious with each passing word. "You're braver than most folks I know," he said one evening as they sat on her porch, the soft glow of the lantern casting flickering shadows across his face. "But this isn't something you can do alone." Over the next few weeks, Jack introduced Sarah to a small group of locals who shared his love for the forest and his disdain for the poachers. Among them was Clara, an elderly woman with a deep knowledge of herbal medicine and a sharp wit that belied her years. There was also Miguel, a former soldier who had settled in the area to escape the chaos of city life. Together, they formed a fragile alliance, bound by a shared desire to protect the forest. At first, Sarah found it difficult to trust them fully. She had spent so long guarding her emotions, keeping others at arm's length, that the idea of relying on anyone felt foreign. But as they worked together mapping the poachers' movements, setting up cameras to document their activities, and sharing meals around a fire, she began to see them as more than just allies. They were a community, a small but determined force standing against the destruction of something they all held dear. One particularly poignant evening, the group gathered at Clara's cabin to share what they had learned. The air was thick with the scent of herbs drying in bundles along the walls, and the warmth of the fire chased away the autumn chill. As they talked, Sarah found herself opening up about her past, about David, the accident, and the grief that had driven her to the forest. Clara placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You came here to heal," she said gently, "and maybe the forest brought you here for a reason." Miguel nodded in agreement. "We've all got our scars," he said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a jagged line running along his forearm. "But scars just mean you've survived. And now, you're fighting for something bigger." Their words stayed with Sarah long after the meeting ended. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the forest, but for herself. The bonds she was forming with these people, fragile though they were, reminded her of the strength that came from connection. As the group's trust in one another grew, so did their determination to take action. Jack spearheaded the effort to track the poachers, using his deep knowledge of the forest to predict their movements. Clara provided medical supplies and advice, ensuring they were prepared for any injuries. Miguel took on the role of protector, teaching Sarah and the others how to defend themselves if the need arose. Sarah, for her part, brought an unwavering resolve to the group. Her encounters with the stag had given her a unique perspective, one that fueled her determination to protect the forest at all costs. Together, they devised a plan to expose the poachers' activities, gathering evidence to present to the authorities while working to dismantle their operations from within. Despite the danger, the group found moments of levity amid the tension. Late one night, as they huddled around a campfire, Jack shared stories of his childhood in the forest, his gruff demeanor softening as he spoke. Clara teased Miguel about his cooking skills, or lack thereof, prompting a round of laughter that echoed through the trees. In these moments, Sarah felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. The forest had given her a second chance not just to heal, but to fight for something worth protecting. And though the challenges ahead were daunting, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. The bonds she had formed with the stag, with the forest, and with her newfound allies would carry her through whatever came next. The stag's enigmatic presence continued to captivate Sarah, and as her bond with it deepened, she couldn't shake the feeling that its actions were far too deliberate to be mere instinct. One evening, as she and Jack sat by a campfire outside her cabin, she decided to press him for answers. "What do you know about the stag?" she asked, her voice quiet but insistent. "The Watcher, as you call him. He's not like any animal I've ever seen." Jack leaned back in his chair, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. For a moment he was silent, as though deciding how much to share. Finally, he said, "There's a story about him. Goes back generations, long before I was around. My grandfather used to tell it to me when I was a kid." He paused, his eyes distant, then began to recount the tale. According to the legend, the stag was part of a rare, ancient species known as the Guardians, creatures said to embody the spirit of the forest. They were larger and more intelligent than ordinary animals, with an uncanny ability to sense danger and intervene when the balance of the forest was threatened. The Guardians were revered by the indigenous people who once lived in the area, seen as protectors of both the land and those who respected it. "But they're just stories," Jack added, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "No one's ever proven they exist. Still, when you see that stag, it makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Sarah listened intently, her mind racing. The stag's behavior, the way it had saved her, guided her, even seemed to protect the forest, fit the story all too well. It wasn't just an animal, it was something more, something tied to the very essence of the wilderness. The revelation left her both awed and unsettled. If the stag truly was a guardian, what did it mean for her and for the forest? As Sarah and the others continued their efforts to combat the poachers, they began to uncover a far more sinister truth. The men operating in Blackwater Forest weren't just rogue hunters, they were part of a larger criminal network dealing in rare and exotic wildlife. The evidence was scattered at first: fragments of overheard conversations, cryptic maps marked with locations far beyond the forest's borders, and the discovery of specialized equipment designed for capturing live animals. Miguel was the first to piece it together. One night, he spread a series of photographs across Sarah's kitchen table, images of transport cages, tranquilizer guns, and handwritten notes in a language Sarah didn't recognize. "This isn't just about meat or pelts," he said grimly. "They're trafficking, selling rare animals to the highest bidder, and the stag. If they get their hands on him, he'd fetch a fortune." The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The stag wasn't just in danger, it was a target. The poachers had likely seen its unusual size and behavior and recognized its value. Her mind raced as she thought of the traps, the bloodied pelts, the campsite littered with evidence of their cruelty. She felt a surge of anger, sharper than anything she'd felt since David's death. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. "Whatever it takes." Jack nodded in agreement. We'll need more evidence, something solid enough to bring the authorities down on them. But we also need to be ready to defend the forest if it comes to that. The stakes had never been higher. The poachers weren't just a local problem, they were part of a global issue, and the forest had become a battleground in the fight against their greed. Amid the escalating conflict, Sarah found herself undergoing a transformation. The woman who had arrived in Blackwater Forest months ago, broken and adrift, was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more resilient, and deeply connected to the world around her. Her bond with the stag played a central role in her growth. Each encounter with the creature reinforced her sense of purpose, reminding her of the beauty and complexity of the natural world. The stag wasn't just her protector, it was her guide, challenging her to face her fears and embrace the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. One particularly profound moment came during a solitary hike. Sarah had been tracking a set of footprints she suspected belonged to the poachers, hoping to gather more evidence. She found herself lost in thought, her mind swirling with worries about the danger she was facing. Suddenly, the stag appeared ahead of her, its antlers catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost ethereal. It didn't flee as she approached. Instead, it stood perfectly still, its dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the weight of her grief and fear lifted, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The stag seemed to radiate a quiet strength, as though reminding her that she was capable of far more than she believed. "I won't let them hurt you," she murmured, the words feeling both like a promise to the stag and to herself. Her connection with the forest deepened as well. She had learned to navigate its trails with ease, to identify its plants and animals, and to sense its subtle rhythms. The forest, once a place of mystery and intimidation, had become her home, a place that reflected her own resilience and adaptability. Her relationships with Jack and the others also played a crucial role in her healing. They had become a surrogate family of sorts, offering her support and companionship in a way she hadn't experienced since David's death. Their shared mission to protect the forest gave her life a sense of meaning she had thought was lost forever. As the stakes continued to rise, Sarah knew the challenges ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time in a long time she felt ready. She wasn't just fighting for the forest or the stag, she was fighting for herself, for the woman she was becoming, and for the chance to create a future where the wilderness could thrive, unspoiled by greed and destruction. The air was electric with tension as Sarah, Jack, Miguel, Clara, and the others made their way toward the poachers' camp. The plan was simple but risky: to document the poachers' activities, disrupt their operations, and drive them out of the forest once and for all. Sarah's heart pounded as she moved silently through the underbrush, the weight of the stakes pressing heavily on her chest. The stag had not appeared for several days, and though its absence worried her, she knew she couldn't let it distract her from the task at hand. The camp was larger than they had anticipated. Crude tents and makeshift shelters were arranged haphazardly around a central fire pit, where several poachers sat talking in low voices. Nearby, Sarah spotted cages, large, reinforced structures that held terrified animals, their eyes wide with fear. The sight made her stomach churn, and her resolve hardened. Jack signaled for the group to spread out, each of them taking positions to document and disrupt the camp. Sarah crept toward one of the cages, her camera in hand, snapping photos of the trapped animals and the equipment scattered around the camp. She had just finished when a voice behind her made her blood run cold. "Well, look who we have here," the wiry poacher sneered, stepping out of the shadows with his rifle raised. "I knew you'd show up eventually." Sarah froze, her heart racing as she weighed her options. Before she could respond, a deafening crash echoed through the camp. The stag burst from the trees, its massive antlers gleaming in the firelight as it charged straight toward the poacher. He stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the ground as the stag reared up, its hooves slamming into the earth with a force that seemed to shake the entire forest. Chaos erupted. The other poachers scrambled to grab their weapons, shouting orders and curses as the stag tore through the camp with a ferocity Sarah had never seen. Jack and Miguel sprang into action, using the distraction to free the animals and dismantle the cages. Clara and the others worked to disable the poachers' equipment, cutting ropes and smashing traps. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that the forest itself was fighting back. The wind howled through the trees, scattering sparks from the poachers' fire and extinguishing their lanterns. Branches creaked and groaned, bending unnaturally to block paths and trap the poachers in a maze of roots and thorns. Animals that had once hidden in fear emerged to join the fray. Foxes darted through the chaos, gnawing through ropes, while a murder of crows dive-bombed the poachers, their cries piercing the night. Sarah found herself in the center of the chaos, her adrenaline surging as she worked to free the last of the animals. A terrified wolf pup whimpered as she pried open its cage, and she barely had time to step back before it bolted into the safety of the forest. As she turned, she saw one of the poachers raising his rifle, his sights set on the stag. "No," she screamed, throwing herself toward the poacher. She tackled him to the ground, the impact knocking the rifle from his hands. He shoved her off, his face contorted with rage, but before he could retaliate, the stag charged. Its antlers struck the ground inches from the poacher, sending him scrambling backward in terror. The stag turned to Sarah, its dark eyes meeting hers for a brief, breathless moment. In that instant, she understood this wasn't just an animal, it was a protector, a guardian tied to the very essence of the forest. And it wasn't just fighting for itself, it was fighting for her, for all of them. The tide began to turn as the poachers realized they were outmatched. Their camp was in shambles, their equipment destroyed, and their numbers dwindling as they fled into the night. Jack and Miguel worked together to subdue the remaining poachers, tying them up with the ropes they had once used to trap animals. But the battle wasn't over yet. The wiry poacher, driven by desperation and rage, had retrieved his rifle and taken aim at the stag. Sarah saw him out of the corner of her eye, and acted without thinking, hurling herself between the poacher and his target. The shot rang out, a deafening crack that seemed to freeze time. She braced for the impact, but it never came. The stag had moved faster than she thought possible, stepping between her and the bullet. It grazed its flank, drawing blood but doing no serious harm. The poacher cursed and tried to reload, but before he could fire again, Miguel tackled him to the ground, wrenching the rifle from his hands. The stag didn't falter. It stood tall and unyielding, blood staining its coat but its eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The remaining poachers, witnessing their leader's defeat, dropped their weapons and fled into the forest. When the dust finally settled, the camp was silent save for the crackling of dying embers. The animals had fled into the safety of the forest, and the poachers who hadn't escaped were tied and subdued. Sarah stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The stag approached her, its movements slow and deliberate. It lowered its head slightly, as though acknowledging her efforts. Sarah reached out instinctively, her hand trembling as it rested against the stag's flank. Its coat was warm and rough beneath her fingers, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what the stag represented. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The stag didn't respond, but in its eyes she saw something that defied explanation and intelligence, a wisdom and a quiet, unyielding strength. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Jack placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We did it," he said quietly. "But it's not over yet. We need to make sure they don't come back." Sarah nodded, her gaze still fixed on the stag. The battle had been won, but the fight to protect the forest was far from over. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of peace, standing beside the creature that had become both her guardian and her guide. Together they had faced the darkness, and together they had prevailed. The clearing was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Smoke curled up from the remnants of the poacher's fire, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah knelt beside the stag, her hands trembling as she examined the wound along its flank. The bullet had grazed it deeply, leaving a gash that oozed blood and matted its russet fur. Though the injury wasn't fatal, it was clear the stag was in pain, its breathing labored but steady. "We need to help him," Sarah said, her voice breaking as she looked up at Jack. He had been binding the wiry poacher's hands with a length of rope but paused to meet her gaze. "I'll get the medkit," he said gruffly, rising to his feet and heading toward the gear they had stashed nearby. Miguel followed, leaving Sarah alone with the stag. She rested a hand gently on its flank, her touch light and hesitant. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for the stag or for herself. Tears blurred her vision as she thought of everything the stag had done for her, for the forest, for all the creatures it had protected. It had fought so fiercely, putting itself in harm's way without hesitation, and now it was suffering because of them. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on her chest. Jack returned moments later, his hands steady as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. The stag flinched but didn't resist, its eyes fixed on Sarah, as though drawing strength from her presence. When the bandaging was complete, Jack sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his pants. "He's tough," he said, his voice soft with respect. "He'll pull through, but he needs rest, and so do you." As dawn broke over the forest, casting its golden light through the trees, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of both relief and sorrow. The poachers were stopped, their operation dismantled, and the forest was safe for now. But the battle had taken its toll. The sight of the injured stag haunted her, a stark reminder of the cost of their victory. The group gathered at the edge of the clearing, their exhaustion evident in their weary faces. Clara stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the forest, as though daring it to present another challenge. Miguel leaned against a tree, his hands raw and blistered from dismantling the poachers' cages. Jack was already making plans, his voice low and determined as he spoke about ensuring the authorities would handle the captured poachers properly. Sarah, however, found herself stepping away from the group, her feet carrying her instinctively toward the stag. It had risen shakily to its feet, standing tall despite its injury. For a moment she simply watched it, marveling at its resilience. Then, as though sensing her presence, it turned its head to look at her. The weight of their shared journey hit her all at once, the moments it had saved her, the way it had guided her through the forest, and the unspoken bond that had formed between them. The stag had been more than a protector, it had been a teacher, showing her the strength and beauty that came from living in harmony with the natural world. "I don't know if I can ever repay you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "but I promise, I'll do everything I can to protect this place. To protect you." The stag held her gaze for a long moment, its dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its massive antlers vanishing among the trees. Sarah stood frozen, her heart aching with both gratitude and loss. That evening, as the group returned to the cabin, the weight of everything they had endured began to settle over them. Jack, ever practical, set about organizing the evidence they had gathered to ensure it reached the right hands. Clara brewed a strong herbal tea, insisting everyone drink to keep their wits sharp. Miguel, despite his exhaustion, sat by the fire, sharpening his knife in silent contemplation. Sarah, however, retreated to the porch, needing space to process the day's events. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, staring out at the forest as the first stars began to appear. The silence was comforting, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of clarity. When she had first come to the forest, she had been running from her grief, her guilt, and the life she could no longer face. But the forest had given her something she hadn't expected: purpose. It had challenged her, healed her, and forced her to confront the parts of herself she had tried to bury. Her thoughts turned to David, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring the sharp sting of pain. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of peace, as though he, too, had become a part of the forest woven into its roots, its streams, and its endless, unyielding life. "This is where I'm meant to be," she whispered. The words a vow to herself and to the forest she had grown to love. By morning, the group had finalized their plans to ensure the poachers would face justice. Jack would deliver their evidence to the authorities, while Clara and Miguel would spread the word among the local community, rallying support to protect the forest from future threats. As for Sarah, she knew her path lay within the forest itself. She had found something here, something worth fighting for, and she wasn't ready to let it go. With the stag's memory fresh in her mind, she resolved to dedicate herself to preserving the forest and its inhabitants, using the strength she had discovered within herself to make a difference. The cabin, once a place of isolation, had become a home, a sanctuary where she could continue to grow, to heal, and to protect the land that had given her so much. And though the challenges ahead were daunting, Sarah felt ready to face them, knowing she wasn't alone. The forest, with all its beauty and mystery, would always be with her, and so would the stag, a silent, enduring presence that would guide her through whatever came next. The forest had fallen silent in the days following the confrontation, its usual hum of life subdued, as though it, too, were recovering from the battle. For Sarah, the stillness was both a comfort and a reminder of the fragility of the wilderness she had come to love. The poachers had been stopped, their operation dismantled, but she knew their departure was not the end. It was merely a reprieve. As she walked through the clearing where the battle had taken place, now strewn with remnants of the poachers' camp, Sarah felt the weight of her responsibility settle firmly on her shoulders. The stag had taught her that the forest was more than a collection of trees and creatures. It was a living entity, interconnected and dependent on those who chose to protect it. Returning to her cabin, Sarah gathered the photographs and evidence they had collected. The images of cages, traps, and the animals who had suffered would be instrumental in rallying support for stronger protections for the forest. With Jack's help, she drafted a report detailing the poachers' activities and the broader implications of their network. She included a personal letter with the report, addressing it to local environmental organizations and government agencies. "The fight to protect this forest is not over," she wrote. "What we've stopped here is just one part of a much larger issue. Wildlife trafficking and habitat destruction are ongoing threats, and they require immediate and sustained action. I urge you to use this evidence to take a stand for the forest, for its inhabitants, and for the generations to come." The act of writing the letter felt cathartic, a tangible way to channel her determination into action. Sarah knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she also knew she couldn't sit idly by while the forest remained vulnerable. Her voice, once hesitant and uncertain, now carried the weight of conviction. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The animals that had fled during the chaos began to return, their cautious movements a testament to their resilience. The trails she walked felt familiar yet new, as though the forest itself were shifting in response to the events that had unfolded. Despite the progress they had made, signs of danger lingered at the edges of the wilderness. Jack reported rumors of other poaching operations in nearby regions, and Miguel mentioned sightings of unfamiliar vehicles parked near the forest's boundaries. The sense of unease Sarah had felt in the months leading up to the confrontation had not entirely dissipated, it had simply shifted, becoming a call to remain vigilant. Sarah's role as a guardian of the forest began to evolve. She worked closely with Jack and the local community to establish patrols and surveillance systems, ensuring that any future threats would be detected early. She also reached out to conservation groups, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned in the hope of inspiring others to take action. The stag's absence weighed heavily on her, but she understood that it had returned to its place within the forest, watching from afar. In its stead, Sarah found herself stepping into the role of protector, drawing strength from the lessons it had imparted. The bond they had shared was a reminder that she was not alone in her mission. The forest itself was her ally, a partner in the fight to preserve its beauty and integrity. One afternoon, as Sarah walked along a familiar trail, she spotted a group of young deer grazing in a sunlit meadow. Their movements were tentative but hopeful, a symbol of the forest's ability to heal. She smiled, a sense of quiet pride filling her chest. The forest was not just a place of solace for her anymore, it was a part of her identity, a reflection of her resilience and determination. But even as she marveled at the meadow's tranquility, she couldn't ignore the challenges that lay ahead. The battle they had fought was one of many, and the forces threatening the forest were vast and complex. She knew there would be more conflicts, more sacrifices, and more moments of doubt. Yet, she also knew that she was ready. The woman who had arrived in Blackwater Forest months ago, lost and broken, had become someone stronger, someone who could face the uncertainty of the future with courage and resolve. The forest had given her a purpose, and she intended to honor it. As Sarah turned to head back to the cabin, a flicker of movement caught her eye. For a brief moment she thought she saw the stag standing at the edge of the trees, its antlers gleaming in the sunlight. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The sight filled her with a sense of both loss and anticipation. The stag's journey and her own were intertwined, and though their paths had diverged, she felt certain they would cross again. Until then, she would continue the work they had begun together, protecting the forest and the countless lives it sheltered. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began sharing her story with a wider audience. She wrote articles, gave talks, and collaborated with conservation organizations to raise awareness about the threats facing forests like Blackwater. Her words carried the weight of her experiences, and her passion resonated with those who heard her. "This forest saved me," she told an audience at a local community event. "It gave me a second chance, and it taught me what it means to fight for something bigger than myself. But it's not just my fight, it's all of ours. The forest needs us, just as much as we need it." The response was overwhelming. People volunteered their time and resources, joining the effort to protect Blackwater Forest and its inhabitants. Sarah's message spread beyond the local community, inspiring others to take action in their own regions. The fight to protect the wilderness was far from over, but for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of hope. The forest, with all its beauty and mystery, would endure because she and countless others were willing to fight for it. And though the challenges ahead were daunting, she knew she wasn't alone. The forest, the stag, and the community she had found were with her, every step of the way. The weeks following the confrontation were a time of both recovery and transformation for Sarah. The forest, once an enigmatic refuge where she sought escape, had become her home, her mission, and her purpose. She embraced her new role as a steward of Blackwater Forest with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. Every day brought new challenges, repairing damaged trails, monitoring wildlife activity, and ensuring the forest remained a sanctuary for its inhabitants, but she welcomed them all with open arms. Sarah's connection to the forest deepened as she began to teach others about its importance. School groups, conservationists, and curious locals visited her cabin, drawn by the story of her fight to protect the wilderness. She shared her knowledge of the plants and animals, the delicate balance that sustained them, and the urgent need to defend these spaces from human greed. Her transformation wasn't just external. The scars of her past, though still present, no longer defined her. The grief that had driven her into isolation had been tempered by the bonds she'd formed with the forest, the stag, and the community she now called her own. In embracing her role as a protector, Sarah had found a way to honor her pain without letting it consume her. The stag's absence in the days after the confrontation had left Sarah with an ache she couldn't quite describe. Though she had seen it vanish into the forest, its injury and its silence weighed heavily on her. She often found herself wandering the trails, searching for any sign of the creature that had become both her protector and her guide. Her patience was rewarded one morning as she stood at the edge of a stream. The stag appeared, stepping out from the shadows with a cautious grace. Its bandaged flank had healed, the wound now a faint scar that bore testament to its resilience. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched it approach, its dark eyes locking onto hers. This time, the stag came closer than ever before. Sarah knelt, her movements slow and deliberate, and extended her hand. The stag's warm breath brushed against her palm as it leaned in, its massive antlers casting intricate shadows on the ground. The connection between them, unspoken but profound, was stronger than ever. Though the stag soon returned to the depths of the forest, its presence lingered in Sarah's heart. It was a symbol of the wilderness she had vowed to protect, a living reminder of the bond between humanity and nature. The stag's legacy became a cornerstone of her work, inspiring those who heard her story to see the forest not just as a resource, but as a partner in the dance of life. As the months passed, the forest began to heal. The scars left by the poachers' trampled clearings, damaged trees, and empty traps were gradually replaced by new growth. The animals that had fled during the conflict returned, their cautious movements giving way to the rhythms of life they had once known. Sarah and the locals worked tirelessly to safeguard the forest's future. They established wildlife corridors, restored damaged habitats, and partnered with conservation groups to ensure the forest would remain protected. Jack, Miguel, and Clara became pillars of the effort, their shared experiences forging a bond that extended beyond their mission. The community's involvement grew as well. Word of their victory and their ongoing work spread, drawing volunteers and support from beyond the region. Children planted trees, artists painted murals of the stag, and local businesses contributed resources to fund the effort. The forest had become more than a place, it was a symbol of resilience, unity, and the enduring power of nature. For Sarah, the sense of harmony extended beyond the forest. She found peace in the routine of her days, in the laughter of the children she taught, and in the quiet moments when she sat on her porch, listening to the symphony of the wild. The cabin, once a place of isolation, had become a hub of connection and hope. Sarah's story, like the forest itself, was one of resilience and transformation. As she reflected on her journey, she realized that her experiences held lessons for everyone, no matter where they lived. The bond she had formed with the forest, and with the stag in particular, was a reminder of the profound connections that exist between humanity and the natural world. Addressing an audience of supporters and newcomers alike, Sarah spoke from the heart. "The forest saved me," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It gave me a purpose when I had none, and it showed me what it means to fight for something bigger than myself. But the fight isn't just mine, it belongs to all of us. The wilderness needs our voices, our actions, and our commitment to ensure it can thrive for generations to come." She shared her hopes for the future, a world where people saw nature not as something to be conquered, but as a partner in their shared journey. She spoke of the lessons she had learned from the stag, from the forest, and from the community that had come together to protect it. Sarah's story wasn't just meant to inspire, it was a call to action. She encouraged her audience to take steps, however small, to protect the natural world around them. Plant a tree, she urged. Volunteer at a local conservation group. Speak up when you see something that threatens the balance of our ecosystems. Every action matters. She ended with a powerful and emotional appeal. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let them know that there is hope, that one person can make a difference, and that together we can protect the beauty and resilience of the natural world. The forest is counting on us, just as it counted on me. Her words resonated, sparking a wave of support that extended far beyond the forest's borders. People shared her story, drawing attention to the ongoing threats facing wildlife and inspiring others to take action in their own communities. As Sarah sat on her porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The fight to protect the forest was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her place, her purpose, and her strength. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, she thought of the stag, its majestic form etched into her memory, its legacy a guiding light for the journey ahead.